So, General, I recall from our last couple of meetings, a number of times you have mentioned that when politics or dialogue fails, the role of military uh, begins, and there is a discord or war is where it comes is where any kind of discussion ends. We are in a world today where we have seen, and you have seen, the effect of World War I or World War II. And we are seeing pocket wars, or huge impact of discord around the world. What would your view be as a military strategist, or for that matter, as a parent of several decades, and the thought what you would like to share to an educator like me, where we are very concerned about the empathy quotient of today's children who will become tomorrow's leaders, and where would we be taking the world to? So I would really like to hear your views on that.
I told you once last time that though technology and science improves and makes your life good, the character and conduct of the human being remains the same.
Right.
Whether it was the Mahabharata war, say, 7,000 years ago, or whether it is today, the fault lies in the character of the human being. Now, when this human being becomes a leader, what is his role? He is supposed to look after his people and also get on well with the other nations in the world. But greed and desire for total power and to dominate over other people is something that is in the human psyche. So therefore, if you look at the world leaders today, I don't think they're very superior human beings. Maybe our Modi is, because he has got a cool mind and he is trying to develop the poverty-stricken parts of our country. Mao Zedong was a great leader, no matter what you say, because he tried to give food and clothing and shelter to his people as soon as he took over in 1949. But he was a dictator, as you know. And I would suggest that by about 1956 or so, that's within 6 or 7 years, he had achieved at least one good plate of rice and gruel that they had ate for every human being in China. And also he achieved some shelter for almost every human being in China. Their population is as large as ours. We still have not achieved that.
Right.
So if you recollect Indira Gandhi's time, she used to talk of roti, kapra, makan. But she never achieved it. So now people can say, okay, all right, we're a democracy and it takes time for us to get anywhere. But we've done a good 75 years now. Still, we find that in remote areas, people are poverty-stricken, right? And we don't have a square meal in the day.
Yes. Yes.
Now, if you look at the present world situation, also World War I, World War II started the same way. The conflicts that have taken place. What is the value of going into conflict when diplomacy could have answered the question? It is, if you take the case of Ukraine now, for instance,
Yes.
right? What is the problem here? Ukraine has been part of the erstwhile Russian Empire. Catherine the Great, if I'm not mistaken, about 300 or 400 years ago.
Yes.
When Ukraine was conquered, it became part of that country, right? So did Siberia, so did so many things. There are two great leaders there, Ivan the Terrible and Catherine the Great, who achieved these tremendous landmass under their control. And so it's been there. Forget about the ancient history. Then, when Soviet Union collapsed, 1991 or thereabout, right? How did it collapse? Because the American people and their governments are always in conflict with the enemy. They have to have an enemy. Now, let me try and explain why they must have an enemy. I said this earlier also in one of my talks. they need an enemy, because unless they have an enemy, the type of uh, defense budgets that are authorized by the Congress will not come there.
Right.
The whole Silicon Valley, almost 40% of the defense budget is paid there for high-ending technology. You recollect that they produced a nuclear bomb towards the end of World War II, 1944 or 45. And they're the only nation which has actually used it,
Right.
destroying millions of people.
Right.
They saved so many American lives. But are American lives superior to Japanese lives? I mean, it's a good question. So it was really a revenge, maybe, in my way of looking at it, for the attack on Pearl Harbor by surprise earlier in 1942, when the Japanese Navy attacked and destroyed a whole lot of Navy of the Americans and destroyed Pearl Harbor. Of course, the Americans wanted to take the revenge, and they did, in due course. They could have used the nuclear bomb on Hitler. They didn't do that. Because whatever you may say, Hitler's a white man, and he's Christian. Whereas the Japanese were yellow people, and they were the enemy. Everybody hated them. We seem to be loving them now. That's a different matter, because that's politics. Now, so when the top leaders don't have the wisdom to go for a peaceful world, they want to have power over the whole world, then conflict results. So now you talked about diplomacy and the various embassies. They are only agents of the political authority. So the diplomat, though he may be very friendly with the opposite side's diplomat, he has to function and have his relations according to his instructions from the political leadership. Therefore, if the political leadership is, let us say, personally oriented for power and wealth, then the diplomat has to obey orders. Now, when the politics fails and diplomacy fails, there is no other arm left with the political authority except the military. So the military comes in when diplomacy and politics has failed, which I said earlier. Now here, in Putin's case, for example, he has been concerned. He is ruling Russia for about 20 years.
Right.
That somehow is not acceptable by the American so-called democracy. If the American president has to change every 4 years, how is it possible for this guy to carry on ruling for 20 years?
Yes.
Now, the same thing with Gaddafi of Lebanon. Putin has mentioned it. He said the Western alliance, that is Britain, France, and America, used their aircraft to bombard Lebanon so badly, on whatever excuse, so that they had to get this man killed, Gaddafi. Gaddafi had ruled for about 30 years. According to them, according to the Western alliance, how can a man be a dictator for 30 years? I mean, what about the people? But those people like their leader. And if you look at the Muslim nations, they're only used to a single leader. They're not used to a democratic situation in their countries. Neither are we, for that matter, because all our history, we've had kings and princes whom we obeyed. But it is only after partition that Jawaharlal Nehru and the Congress Party, the assistance of Mahatma Gandhi, brought in a democracy, for whatever it's worth, right? And a democracy means that you have to have an opposition and you have to discuss in parliament anything before the government decides. But you notice that today, many of the democracies are becoming more and more powerful. And the leader is becoming more and more dictatorial.
Yeah.
They bash up the party, take India. Can you speak of opposition? I mean, there is no opposition. The only national opposition was the Congress Party that we battered to smithereens. Not only because they have not shaped up and they had very poor leadership, I could say, but also that the whole effort of the ruling party is to try and not let them get up again. See, other people are trying to fulfill that role. We wait and see in the election what happens. But we do have an election. And we are very lucky that we have had an election commission, which started from Nehru's days. And that election commission became totally independent under session. That must have been about 1990 or so, 1989-90, when he became the chief election commissioner. He was a total slave of the Gandhi family, let me tell you. Many people used to call him Alsatian, not Station, because Alsatian, he was the Kutta of the Gandhi family. So, but when he became the election commissioner and got total authority and power with only the Supreme Court above him. He sorted everybody out to get the elections done correct.
That's correct.
See?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we are very lucky that we had a leader there. And he did extremely well. So we are lucky in that way. I think we are lucky to have the present leadership in India because Modi has done a lot for the poverty-stricken people of India. There's no doubt, despite what the opposition says. But now conflict, if it comes, a whole lot of treasury is spent on the conflict. I told you last time that there is a border between India and China, which is not demarcated. We
Right.
blame the Chinese for not coming to the table and settling it. They blame India for not coming to the table and settling it because India insists on its requirement and China insists on it. So you require some wisdom here because willy-nilly, you have to come to a border, otherwise there's conflict. Right. Mark you, even if there is a border, there is conflict, but if you don't have a border, then he says, this is my territory, you say it's mine, and so therefore the balloon goes up. Now, in Russia's case, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1991, how did it collapse? The American military machine became more and more powerful, and the Soviet, being a communist country, since there were no taxes,
Right.
every human being had to be given money and food and board and lodging and kept warm in the winter. All spent by the state, right? They had no value for the money. But since they had to more and more technology in their weapon systems, and build up a huge military system, and the most advanced weapons, I must say, they're the ones who first put the Sputnik up, with the like of the dog. They were the first man in space was done by them, their technology.
Yes.
Yuri
Yeah.
Gagarin, who became a marshal of the Soviet Air Force, you see? And that technology they've got. That's the brains.
Right.
They've tried very hard to catch up with America from the point of view of the nuclear weapon, which they've done. They've got as many nuclear weapons, if not more, than what the United States has. Now, the tussle between America and the erstwhile Soviet Union, there were two basic powers on Earth, the superpowers.
Right.
And all of us had to obey the instructions because they were the winners of the World War II and had made themselves the masters of Earth, and they were ruling us. Many of us said that you can't rule the Earth forever and ever just because you won a war in 1945. What about us? Why can't we rule the world?
Yeah.
Right? I myself has had many arguments with some of their leadership. And I said that how do you say that you got nuclear weapons, I can't have them?
Right.
Why you want to rule the world forever? You're not going to allow that. And if you can have the nuclear weapons, so can I. How do you stop it? So, all right, it took us time because the Congress party, if you recollect, did a nuclear explosion. It's a demonstrator.
Yes.
Indira Gandhi called it the peaceful nuclear demonstration. We laughed and said, what is the meaning of peaceful? The peaceful meaning is that it's a detonation of a bomb, but it has not been developed into a weapon. And she stopped developing because of the sanctions that were put on the country, some of which are still existent. See, when Vajpayee was going to take over, this first time different rulership was coming into the country, either the Congress had ruled all the time, or their cohorts,
Right.
or people who had been ex-congressmen in the coalition
Right.
government.
Yes.
We were in a total mess in this country. And then in 1989 or thereabout, 88, 89, no, sorry, I beg your pardon, 98, 99, Vajpayee managed to, I was retired and I went and met him actually. And because one of his drinking buddies is from my school, the RIMC, he's an Rotary College. And he was Mr. Gatate, who was an advocate in the Supreme Court. He was a lawyer. And he and I were very friendly in the way that he had a lot of brains because he's a legal man. And in the RIMC, we don't know whether we have many brains or not. We just have a lot of go and a lot of gumption, maybe. But we respected that man. And he and I became good friends. And I used to discuss so many things with him, even after my retirement. And he asked me, he said, look, this Vajpayee is my drinking pal, right since your hostel in Allahabad University. And they were students studying for their bachelor's degree. Every evening they used to get together with a bottle of whiskey, and half was drunk by the one and the other half was drunk by the other every day. Scotch whiskey, which cost a lot of money in those days.
Yes.
So he said that he's my pal and he drinks as much as I do, and probably one of these he die of a ruined liver, which happened actually later. So he said, would you like to talk to him? I'm going to be the prime minister in another couple of weeks. So I went and met him. I had only 20 minutes. He didn't say anything. I just gave him 2 points. I said, look, as a nation, if you are going to cow down and refuse to have a nuclear weapon because of Mahatma Gandhi's non-violence, non-violence does not mean that you should not be powerful. Non-violence means that your mind has to be so cool and collected that you use wisdom and don't use weapons of destruction. But you have them so that the other guy who has them is deterred from using them.
Right.
The whole aspect and idea of a nuclear weapon is deterrence, not war fighting. I give you a story from the Mahabharata. I mentioned it. Did I mention it earlier? I'm not sure. I don't remember.
No, tell me.
When Arjun was fighting against Karan,
Right. No, you haven't mentioned it. Please tell.
Arjun was fighting against Varun. They're both in chariots, or Rath, as we call it. The Lord Krishna was driving the Rath of Arjun, and Karan had some other flunky driving his Rath. See? And they were firing arrows at each other. In those days, we call them arrows, but maybe the technology was higher. They must have been much better, higher class weapon. And when Karan used to fire an arrow, Arjun's Rath used to be thrown back by 100 meters. But when Arjun fired an arrow, Karan's Rath was thrown back by 300 meters.
Okay.
But the Lord, who was the charioteer, every time Arjun's Rath was thrown back 100 meters, he said, "Va Karan, va Karan," full of praise for that fighter. Arjun, as usual, got a little excited on that. He says, "Damn good show. I am throwing it back 300 meters, and you are giving him the good va Karan, the accolades. When he only threw me back 100 meters." So the Lord said, "Arjun, I am sitting on your Rath with the weight of the 3 worlds. That's this world, the upper world, and the nether world. And if I had not been sitting on this Rath for 3 worlds, you would have gone into orbit." That's the power of his arrow. So Arjun got a little angry. Perhaps that's what's happened to Putin also. She took out the Brahmastra. Now, the Brahmastra is the nuclear weapon.
Right.
The word Brahmastra is in the Mahabharata. The Brahmastra, the Brahmas, the great creator of earth. Brahmastra, his weapon, which destroyed the whole earth. So Arjun took it out. The Lord said, "Please put it away. He's also got one." So if you use it, he'll use it too, and the world will get destroyed. He said, "Look here, you have to defeat that gentleman there. You don't have to destroy the earth for it. That means you'll also be dead, he'll also be dead, so will everyone else.
Right.
So please put it away." So the nuclear deterrence, which came out very loud and clear during the Cuba Missile Crisis in 1962. The Cuba Missile Crisis in 1962 is exactly what is happening today.
Oh, okay.
The NATO and Americans were moving more and more eastward, closing into the Soviet Union's borders and placing nuclear weapons there. That means that they had radars and weapons which could pick up the Soviet firing of nuclear weapons, immediately giving them the chibi, giving them the warning, so that they could use their anti-ballistic missile systems to prevent that missile from hitting their land. But to have a balanced deterrence on both sides must be equally balanced. If one side becomes more powerful, you may start a war tomorrow. See? So Khrushchev, who was then the chairman of the Communist Party in Soviet Union, he told them that if you do this, I'll put nuclear weapons, you're putting them in my backyard, he says. So I will put them in your backyard, because Cuba was a communist country. So he set sail with certain ships, warships, with nuclear weapons to be put into Cuban territory after getting the acceptance from the Cuban authorities. Kennedy, who was Jack Kennedy was the president of America. He said, I'll stop them from coming because he had a huge navy. And Cuba is just south of the United States. So he lined up his navy with atomic weapons and everything to prevent this flotilla of the Russians from reaching Cuba. Well, the Russians also had nuclear weapons with their ships, and so we nearly went to a nuclear war between the two. So then eventually Khrushchev took the red telephone and rang up Kennedy directly. He said, look, we don't want to destroy each other. So let's call it off. So they called it off. So how does the Western world think that they can keep on getting closer and closer to the Russian borders and not prevent the Russians from doing the same? That's the crux of the situation, in short words. So Ukraine has become independent in 1991 when Soviet Union gave them the independence, just like the Central Asian states. They were part of Russia. And now Kiev and Sevastopol, the naval port, is the only warm water naval port that the Russians have. Otherwise, they've got Archangel in the north and all that, which is frozen for 6 months a year. They've got Vladivostok in the east, which is again frozen for 6 months a year. So the only warm water port is the Black Sea in southern Russia, which is Sevastopol. Now, that was given by Khrushchev to Ukraine earlier because it was a Soviet state. So he says, you manage it, administration and all that. But now, when Ukraine wants to join the NATO and making noises to that extent, then Soviets went and reoccupied that place because all those people there are Russian speaking and they prefer to be Slavs, Slavs are Orthodox Christians. They're not Protestants or Catholics. So they've got a religious cohesion. Plus, they're the same people, the same community, the same clan, shall I call it. Right? Now, this is the situation. So NATO was raised as a North Atlantic Treaty Organization to protect Europe, Western Europe, from the Soviet Union, which has a massive army and all that. After the Russian collapse, that danger went away. The first president of Russia that was appointed, Gorbachev was the president when he signed away the authorities of the Soviet Union. And Yeltsin, who was selected by acceptance by the United States also, was going to become the next president. And he was asked, many people say that Yeltsin was a CIA agent. CIA, the American agent. A lot of money. Children being educated in Harvard and all that sort of thing, you see. So he was asked to tell Gorbachev to make the Communist Party of Russia illegal. Right? So that Gorbachev had to accept it. She accepted it. What did Gorbachev get for it? He's an American citizen now. He's living in the United States. He got plenty of money. He's living in ease and comfort. He's the ex-president of the Soviet Union. Right? So you bought him out. And Yeltsin did his rulership for some years, and then Putin, who was the head of the KGB, the intelligence, he took over from Yeltsin. Putin is trying to bring Russia back onto its feet. The position of Russia after when Yeltsin was the ruler was that they had no money. So the oligarchs are the Gunda group with a lot of money. The mafia. Mafia took over Russia. Because, once you cancel the Communist Party, the whole bureaucracy disappeared in one day. Think of India. We may not like our bureaucracy, but every bit of this country is run by the bureaucracy. It's got various departments of government. Don't think that the politicians are running. The politicians give a direction. The actual administration of the country is by the bureaucracy. So willy-nilly, you like it or not, they're running the show. Right? If you suddenly decide that they've disappeared in one day, this country will be in a mess. Trains will stop moving. Trade will stop. There'll be no rations in the shops. Where are they coming from? Transport has to move and railways have to move, and it's all done because of the rules. if the bureaucracy disappears, there are no rules. That's what happened. And it was deliberately done by the Western nations, in my estimate, to destroy this country. So when Putin took over, his first job was to catch hold of these oligarchs who were so rich, they were criminals. They made a lot of money themselves, but they gave bribes to railway trains to move and for people to take out. You see, the Ural Mountains, which are divide Western Russia from Eastern Russia. That means from the European Russia to dividing the Asian Russia. All the resources are on the east of the Ural Mountains in Siberia, where you have labor and all that, forced labor, if you like, doing the mining and all that, and trains from there bring the raw material to all the factories which are in Western Russia, so that the goods can be produced, whether it's weapons of war, whether it's ammunition, whether it's food, resources, whatever you like. So if the oligarchs are controlling that, then Mr. Putin, who became the president, had no power at all. So he went out of his way to catch hold of these chaps, which he did. Of course, the Western world, whenever Putin goes after any of these, they cry high and mighty that he's being very unfair, he's a bloody dictator and he's doing this, he's doing that, but he's sorting his country out. Unfortunately, he hasn't brought up the economy. Maybe he's not knowledgeable enough, or his economic advisors are not knowledgeable enough to bring it up, whatever the reason. The only exports of Russia are oil, basically.
Right.
Oil and gas, weapons and equipment. So for oil and gas, he's sending to Europe, getting a lot of money from there. Main pipelines went through Ukraine. So Western world and NATO and all that encourage Ukraine to stop those oil pipelines. So those were stopped. Now this guy is making a new pipeline going through the Baltic Sea to reach directly Germany, because Germany has no energy. They don't have nuclear power plants. They don't believe in coal power plants. So they don't have enough rivers for hydro. It's too small. So they have to borrow energy. Energy comes from oil and gas to heat their homes in the terrible winter. We Indians are very lucky. We've got the Himalaya to stop those tundra cold winds coming in the winter and freezing us to minus 20 Celsius or minus 40 Celsius. North of the Himalayas, that's the temperature in the winter. Every home has to be heated. They cost a lot of money. So you require a lot of energy for that. Oil and gas and so on. So Germany would freeze to death if this oil doesn't come. So now, between the present leadership of Germany and pushing by the United States trying to get oil elsewhere from other places, including themselves. They've got shale oil, we'll say it is more expensive. And to stop the Russian pipeline, so the economy of Russia drops some more. Plus, they put all these sanctions. The sanctions are quite nasty, because the ruble's value falls and international trade stops, and you can't sell things. He sold 10 years of oil to China, got $40 billion for it, coming so much a year. China's wanting more. Now, look at the role of China. The only man who pointed this out is Donald Trump, the ex-president.
Yeah.
He says your main future enemy is China.
Yeah.
So why are you killing this project? You see, you've thrown Russia into the arms of China. We Indians can't imagine why this should be done, because we don't want the Chinese to become too powerful.
Right.
But with Russian joining them, that becomes a very powerful military entity. There are a lot of resources in Siberia. The snows of Siberia, the permafrost as it's called, a number of kilometers of frozen earth is melting. There are fires in the tundra region, which is full of snow. Now, if that happens, resources of the whole earth are under the Siberian plateau. Name it. All the mica, the nuclear stuff, the oil, the gas, everything.
Yeah.
And also in the Arctic Ocean, right? And the largest border with the Arctic Ocean is that of Russia. See? So, what's China's interest? Chinese interest is they want to get into the Siberian region, right, because they want all those resources. They got the money, right, and they're ready to give it to the Soviets, to the Russians.
Yes.
So now what is happening is that since the ice is melting in the Arctic Ocean, the distance for trade of ships from, let us say, Chinese eastern ports to the Atlantic Ocean is only 1/3 if you go through the Arctic Ocean rather than if you come to the Indian Ocean.
Oh, okay.
That means they trade to the West and to
Mm.
Europe and to America
Yes.
would become so much cheaper because the transportation is so much. See?
Mm.
So they're wanting to get in there.
Mm.
And Xi Jinping is quietly sitting with a smile on his face
Mm.
when these Europeans are breaking their heads.
Mm.
Because he becomes more powerful.
Mm.
How do you stop him? So I don't know where this is going to go, but I don't think the leadership on all these sides are too wise. There's no reason for NATO to keep on trying to break Russia into bits. It's a Democratic Party more in America which feels this way. They are very liberal and they don't believe in dictatorship. They think Putin is a dictator, therefore he must be removed. And number two is they need an enemy, because if they have a good enemy, then they get a large amount of defense budget authorized by the Congress, which is they spend for their new technologies, which keeps them ahead of the rest of the world. Right? What is their power? Their power is not only military power, but the technological power, science power, the cutting edge. Right? If you look what's happening in China, they are the only single nation on earth which has got a space station. They're firing missiles, we've got the space station, they're training their astronauts. Otherwise, there's an international space station which is going to break up and fall down in another year or so. And some of the main pieces may fall on Indian territory. We don't know. We hope it falls in the Indian Ocean and not on our heads. But whatever it is, it's a couple of tons, a large number of tons. So it is up there in the sky, but that was a joint effort between Soviet Union and the United States. China is the only nation which got its own. So I think a little more wisdom is necessary here. Since it's not available, we take a deep breath and wait for the disaster to happen. Well, another point with Putin is he is rattling up the nuclear power by placing his nuclear weapons on high alert, which he did yesterday and day before. Now, that's not really the way to go, because you don't want nuclear. That means he is becoming desperate, in my view. You don't want an enemy leader or so-called enemy leader, who's not really an enemy, but you made him an enemy, to become mad.
You're pushing him to a corner and bringing out the worst.
Yeah. If he starts firing these weapons, we'll have World War III, nuclear war, and none of us are going to be able to avoid the fallout, the cloud that will come into our country. Luckily, we have Himalayas. I hope less comes here and more goes to Europe if it does happen. But the fact of the issue is it's not good for civilization.
Yeah.
Right? So therefore, one shouldn't threaten that. It's a deterrence. Just keep it quiet and keep it there. And that's all. People should know you've got it and that's enough. You can't sort of rattle it and take it out and say, look, I've got this. So, Nivedita, just a scene. Ukraine itself has been provoking the Russians because it wants the assistance of NATO and the money and the support that comes. So far, it hasn't come. But he pleaded even yesterday and today, he's pleading that make me a NATO member straight away, because if he makes a NATO member, then NATO forces can come into Ukraine to defend. Now, Russia's attack on Ukraine has been slow. This is the 5th day, I think, or 6th day that we're getting into. They haven't captured any of the cities. You know, capturing a city is not easy. We in the Indian Army try to avoid cities altogether.
Okay.
Because if the population resists you, and they've armed the local civilians, even the ladies and everybody have picked up a gun and get to know how to shoot it, and they decide, all right, we'll defend our country. But you'll notice that the Russian soldiers are not wanting to attack the civilians. There was a line of tanks where the civilians stood in front, they didn't want to overrun the poor chap. See? So, of course, the newspapers give headlines that was such a brave Ukrainian, but you must also see that from the Russian side, their job is not to kill the civilians. They try and avoid it if possible. But they're shelling the cities, and the cities are being hit by bombs and by missiles, which is affecting the local population, which is getting killed and which has to run from there. Maybe 1 million plus have already run away.
Yeah.
20,000 of our students and Indians are stuck there. Some 3,000 or 4,000 have been brought out, but they're all trying to run. Lot of politics. With Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, he's really by profession a dancer and joker. He was elected president. He's a Jew. His parents have been through the Holocaust. He's turned out to be a very good leader. They offered to remove him from there, NATO, because he's under threat. Russian commando groups are out to kill the poor chap, but he decided to stay. And he's encouraging the people. He's armed the civilians. I'm staying right here, and that will encourage the civilians to give a good fight to the Russians. So compliments to Mr. Zelensky, because he did very well. But he is howling and screaming to join NATO so that NATO troops can't come into Ukraine according to the rules so far. Anyone can break the rules because it's not a NATO member yet. And it hasn't been a NATO member since 1992. So Putin, having built up the question that you're trying to make him a NATO member, is also a little bit of a propaganda, if you ask me. But Eastern Russia and Sevastopol and these areas which Russia has occupied, if, in my view, strategically, Putin a few days back, 7 days back, accepted the independence of the Donetsk region, Donbass region, Eastern Ukraine,
Right.
who had he accepted them as independent republics. And when they invited him to bring the troops there to defend them against the attacks that were going on by Ukraine army, he brought his troops. If he had stayed there, he would have achieved much more than by actually attacking Ukraine. Because then what happens is that the thing halts and we can get back to diplomacy.
Right.
But if you are attacking and you get into Ukraine, what is the future here? I don't think Russians can rule Ukraine. The people are not desirous of that.
Right.
So they want it to be a democracy. So they can't be under a dictatorial sort of rule.
Right.
So there's no future there. So I don't think he wants to stay there. I think he wants to change the government or whatever and then get out from there.
Right.
We wait and see. So enough on that.
Yes. So I'd like a follow-up question on that. That when you are edging on, when you're edging on ensuring that your enemy or your opposition is getting into the side of enemy, as a young person, we all have our enemies, and you have had a whole round of encounters with enemies or opposition. What kind of mindset at that point in time helps you to not push the enemy to a corner? What kind of leadership capabilities do the organizations, whether it is your corporate organization or schools or RIMS for that matter, is there a role of teaching, learning for leaders out there? Because leaders will become military people, leaders will become politicians, leaders will become corporate managers. In all spheres, they will be in schools, they will become principals, visionaries, they will found schools. Where is the role of diplomacy? I mean, at what stage it comes before empathy, compassion, pity, understanding, and what have you learned, and what would be your guiding lessons that you have had, which ensures these kind of thought processes?
You notice that in military senior leadership,
Right.
the ones who get killed in war. Right?
Which is not the common belief. For people like us, we think it's the infantry which gets killed, or the fighter pilot who gets killed, not the...
No. After all senior leaders in the military have started from the lowest rank. They've been through it. They've survived.
Right.
I've been through 2 wars.
Uh,
I survived.
hmm.
Survival is the main factor of promotion.
Right.
So when you survive and you've got that experience and reach higher rank, then you're not on the front.
Hmm.
On the front, the leadership is by captains,
Right.
lieutenants,
Hmm.
majors,
Hmm.
and at best lieutenant colonels or colonels who are
Right.
commanding troops.
Right.
As you go higher ranks, you're not commanding troops, you're commanding the commanders who are commanding troops.
Right. Right.
But that's the hierarchy.
Right.
But those guys have got the experience of battle
Right.
or of experience of how to control. I'd like to say one thing here. When you start a conflict,
Hmm.
politically, diplomatically, or militarily, you must be able to control when it should halt.
Ah,
Military conflict can generally go out of hand.
right.
Expect to achieve certain tasks
Hmm.
and then call it off.
Hmm.
But the enemy may not agree with you,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
So the wise leader is able to discern, and even it's a discussion between the politician and the military services and the diplomatic service. We're all together, we all put our heads together. The question is that if you start a conflict, how far are you going to let it escalate?
Right.
It should not escalate beyond a point where you have no longer control over what the
Right.
result is going to be.
Which is a
So-
mindset issue. Will it not be a
Right.
mindset issue? Yeah.
All fighting is mind. The
Hmm.
human mind is the one
Hmm.
that you mentioned a mind. Let me tell you, you are never defeated. Even though you may be beaten up in the battle, you are never defeated till your mind is defeated. If your mind is not defeated, you're going to fight for the rest of your life. It's no longer a case where armies went and conquered areas and armies went and did what they liked, and the poverty and the peasant carried on with their work with least interest. The peasantry was not involved. They carried on producing their food and selling it and making their life. Armies came and went, they couldn't care a damn who was the ruler. They were only worried about taxes.
Right.
But now, with the education and the borders of nations having been firmed up, the borders are firmed up now.
Right.
In the old days, there were no borders.
Yeah.
Just to digress, borders were created in the Treaty of Westphalia around about 1640. The prime mover of this was the great Cardinal Richelieu, the powerful man of France. Cardinal Richelieu, if you read the Three Musketeers, for
Yes.
instance,
Yes.
if the Three Musketeers and D'Artagnan or whatever his name is, are trying to fight on behalf of the king against Cardinal Richelieu and his men. But that is fiction. Right? In actual practice,
Yeah.
Richelieu was made the regent of the state because Louis XIV,
Hmm.
the great Louis, the Golden King,
Yes. Yes.
and who became the most powerful king in Europe.
Hmm.
Louis XIV was only a kid, only 14 or 15 years old when Cardinal Richelieu became the regent of France. Right? So that when Louis became 18 or 19 and became the king, then he was going to be the leader. So Richelieu at that time found that there were so many wars. The great powers on earth on Europe at that time were Poland, France, Spain, and the Pope. The Pope in Italy was a very powerful man.
Hmm.
He had conquered a large amount of territory. In fact, the whole of Italy was under his control.
Hmm. Hmm.
So these four people used to keep fighting each other. So he made a proposal, Richelieu, that to have peace, we must decide on borders. So that whichever prince, let's say the Prince of Poland, can do what he likes within his border, we won't interfere, but he must not cross the border.
Okay.
So he knew that he may not get agreement with these four very powerful leaders. So he took them one at a time.
Hmm.
In Westphalia, which is Western Germany in the vastest forest area, right? It's a small village there. They had a treaty there. First, he called the Prince of Poland, and they came to the conclusion, okay, and they both signed.
Yeah.
Having done that, then he called the King of Spain. Separate treaty with a made him sign. Then he requested the Pope to come and saying that people already signed, now you also sign, so you also sign.
Yeah.
The deal here is let's firm the borders and let the prince do what he likes inside his border. You don't interfere. Don't try and put your ideas on the subject. He's the boss. Let him do what he likes in his country. But he mustn't cross the border. Otherwise, Europe had faced 100 years war. It had faced a 50 years war. It had another 40 years war.
Right, right.
This is 1640. This was signed, so there were peace for about 150 years till World War I started. That was 1940. That also started because the Archduke of Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria and Hungary, they had the double-headed eagle sign, right? They conquered the whole area, and the Archduke was visiting Sarajevo in erstwhile Yugoslavia, and now Bosnia-Herzegovina, right? And there's a bridge. I visited that bridge. He happened to cross, and they had a fellow, a crook, who had been paid money by somebody, who shot him. He came in his carriage with his wife and shot him dead. That was the start of World War I. Because the Austrian armies moved against Serbia. Serbians are Slavs, and the Austrian army are Teutonic races, racial difference. Plus, the Austrian army was, I think, Protestant at that time, or about to be. The Serbian people are Orthodox Christianity. They have a different system of religion. So they moved against Serbia. But Serbia being Slav, same ethnic quality like the Russians came to his aid. So when the Russian troops moved in, then the German troops moved against it. And then when Poland was, then the British came in and everybody came in. So you had allies on one side and you had the Russians and Slavs on the other side. And we had World War I, which carried on for almost 5 years. And the Kaiser of Germany, the King of Germany, eventually sued for peace. You have the Treaty of Versailles in France in 1919, where the treaty was so nasty against the Germans that, they wouldn't let them survive. They said, you have to pay us money, the reparations for the cost that we've gone under. He had no money. And if the American Army Chief Marshall, who did the Marshall Plan, they said, unless you lift up Germany and bring its industries back into functioning, they won't be able to pay us our reparations. So lifting of Germany was done by them. But this treaty was such that it was the rise of Hitler. The rise of Hitler was to take revenge. See, so now there's a lack of wisdom amongst the leadership here, so let's not go further into it. So I think the top leadership must be able to control escalation of military conflict. Because nobody knows what's going to happen in the military conflict. You think you're going to overpower somebody, but he may not be over. As I said earlier, if his mind is not broken, now you take our 1971 war, India and Pakistan, when we moved into East Pakistan, right, to destroy that. The ruler of West Pakistan, or a ruler of Pakistan at that time, we had a Lieutenant General Niazi on the other side, who later became the army chief, by the way, because they had court-martial proceedings against him for giving up to the Indian army.
General Niazi was much talked about,
No, but he proved that he was not responsible, that Yahya Khan, the president of Pakistan, was responsible for not helping him. He said the Americans are helping, but he didn't send Pakistan forces there. Or maybe he could not send because we had a naval blockade there. So anyway, Yahya Khan was the president. I think he gave up because it shattered his mind. So when you lose in your mind and accept loss, then you're finished. That's how we won that war. But again, when Indira Gandhi did the Shimla conference, 1972, many of us questioned that you didn't get the independence of Kashmir, you didn't do so many things. We had 93,000 prisoners, we gave them back, and what did you get in return? And Bhutto, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the father of Benazir Bhutto, and that young girl, Benazir was also there, she was 16 years old. She accompanied her father. Bhutto pleaded that if I have to remain president of Pakistan, don't force me to make a border in Kashmir, because I'll be thrown out. You see? So I think, I don't know, I think our Prime Minister at that time, Mr. Gandhi, decided to be merciful, to allow Pakistan to survive. You see, this is, in a way, wisdom. Otherwise, the conflict would carry on. Then we had collected our troops on the western side. And of course, United Nations, Russia, America, everybody advised Indira Gandhi, don't go further. And Indira Gandhi stopped them. Our military commanders were ready to go into West Pakistan also, because the additional forces came from the east after the conquest of East Pakistan. So this is wisdom where you called it off. But that wisdom, unfortunately, has not responded in Pakistan, who still want to take revenge. So